Sometimes words are just words, interchangeable and discardable. But sometimes a word belies a knot in our thought, tightly wound and tensely connected. Anarchy is one such word. Centuries ago, the English peasantry rose up to overthrow the king and to radically remake society. The vanguard of this revolution, the levelers and the diggers, sought to demolish the feudal hierarchy, to revise property and the division of land. In their revolt, they were joined by opportunists who sought the overthrow of the king to assert their own power. Naturally, these factions clashed. It was in the Civil War that the word anarchy was leveraged to great effect. Those with the audacity to explicitly oppose anyone ruling over anyone were characterized as desiring anarchy, and when this happened, the idealistic rebels were forced to backpedal, to stumble and to prevaricate into a trap built into their very language. The word anarchy originates in the Greek word anarchia, in other words, without rulership. Over the last couple millennia, it has grown two simultaneous associations. Firstly, the absence of domination and constraint, and secondly, a war of competing would-be rulers. The latter redefinition was inspired by the constant conflict between princes and small lords that it was felt had gripped Europe during the Middle Ages in the absence of a single ruler. While the first definition is more clearly the better fit with the word's etymology, the latter signified something more properly akin to spasarchy, or fractured domination, than the absence of domination. But in practice, these two definitions grew to be lumped together as the same thing, functionally serving as an Orwellianism. Like a much more condensed version of the phrase freedom is slavery, the invocation of anarchy thus served to write out of our language the ability to speak of a world that wasn't characterized by domination. To desire the end of domination was thus transmuted into merely desiring a different, more decentralized configuration of domination. This perspective mirrors that of our rulers and would-be rulers, who cannot conceive of anything besides rule or be ruled. It's the fascistic or authoritarian perspective in which there exists nothing besides the game of power. If rulership is all there is, if it is inescapable, then without rulership, or anarchy, signifies a senseless and incoherent concept, and the word should, in the authoritarian mind, be reassigned to be more productively characterized as a less centralized set of power relations. This reframing of anarchy in terms of centralization rather than domination is an obvious trick, because decentralized expressions of rulership or interpersonal domination can be quite severe. Parental abuse of children, partner abuse, sexual violence, community ostracization, many other informal power dynamics of social capital are often far more visceral and constraining in most people's everyday lives than war, taxes, and police repression. Exploitation at the hand of the thief, the bandit, the mugger, or the rapist, the brigand, the minor warlord, it's hardly any different than at the hand of the cop or the bureaucrat. Centralization and decentralization each have their own efficiencies and inefficiencies when it comes to domination and constraint. Centralization allows one to take advantage of certain economies of scale, but decentralization can allow more intimate and attentive abuse. It makes little sense to quibble over whether the decentralization of the Rwandan genocide made it more efficient at horror than the Third Reich. Decentralization may be a necessary component of liberation, but it is hardly sufficient. The real issue is domination itself. Similarly, domination can be quite sharply constraining, even without a clearly defined hierarchy. Two people can chain each other down, sometimes without ever gaining an advantage. Indeed, we often interact in ways that are mutually oppressive. More complex or balanced dynamics of domination that defy description in terms of simple hierarchy do not necessarily diminish the domination at play. For those of us who seek the abolition of such dynamics altogether, who strive in the direction of a world entirely without domination, without rulership over one another, it's impossible to avoid a contest over the definition of anarchy. Language channels and focuses our thoughts. A definition determines what can be expressed succinctly and what presumptions we will gravitate towards. So it was like a thunderclap when in the 19th century someone finally declared anarchy is order, government is civil war, and a movement promptly grew like wildfire. We declared ourselves anarchists as a provocation, but also as a corrective, because we will never be able to make serious headway towards freedom unless the concept itself is conceivable. Unfortunately, just as the term anarchy has been saddled with negative associations, so too has the concept of freedom become muddied in ways that often keep us chained. In wider society, freedom is often used in very loose ways. If we dislike something, we characterize the absence of it as freedom from it. This freedom quote-unquote, refers to nothing more than the negation of a given thing, and obviously not can never functionally or coherently behave as a general ideal. Negation is meaningless when it's not prepared with a specific concept. The absence of one thing always means the presence of another thing. Thus is, in this sense, freedom invoked by authoritarians of all colors. The soldiers and the cops beating us are said to protect our freedom, which is to say a freedom from disruption, the freedom to exist in a certain state of affairs, no matter how noxious, the freedom to maintain a certain static culture or set of traditions, free from change and challenge. This sort of freedom is never anything more than the securing and preserving of some kind of identity, some specific static gray world. Thus does the conservative quite seriously declare that the two gay men holding their hands in the public square violates his freedom. To survive conflicts of such freedoms, a number of systems of détente have been proposed. The most common today is the proprietarian resolution, wherein the world is physically divided up and within each clearly demarcated bubble, owners may structure things according to their unique desires or identities. There are certainly many practical upsides to giving everyone their own garden to play in. But, as an abstract, the negative concept of freedom obscures the positives to collaboration, as well as the innate arbitrariness and constraint of static identity. To worship a notion of freedom as isolation from outside forces would leave us all chained in prisons, frozen statues walled off, and incapable of engagement and development. This notion of freedom as a rigor mortis, the freedom of the coffin, is innately authoritarian, but it is also deeply arbitrary. It's not clear which authority or identity we should adopt. There are so many different corpses we might strive to reduce ourselves to, forever free of external influence. What mere freedom from deprives us from is active agency. True freedom is, of course, not about retreating from or walling off outside influences, but about having choice in our interactions with the world. Not a single isolated choice of a certain identity or role, but a continual, engaged, active choice at every moment in our lives. When we truly live, we are hurricanes of self-reflection, pulling in knowledge and influences from the wider world, the universe wrapping in on itself in a self-awareness that expands the scope of what is possible. To truly be free, liberated of constraints, can only mean to have more options, not to be confined within some arbitrary box, but radiating ever outward into the world. Note that such freedom isn't a zero-sum game. Every single person can remake the world. Creation and discovery are not exclusive acts. A society where every person was equally unleashed to discover titanic insights or to create profoundly moving art would not be a gray world of mediocrity, because impact and influence is not a scarce good. We can each be heroes. We can each change everything. We can each bring in more options to the world. In this proper light, there is no inherent conflict between the freedom of individuals, because freedom is a larger and more general phenomenon. To fire a gun at your neighbor's head would gravely deprive the world of possibility. True freedom is not predicated upon the imprisonment of others, but upon their liberation. In our muddied and corrupted language, it's often easy to mistake power and freedom as the same thing. Yet unlike power, which is a kind of directed capacity, a relation between distinct entities, freedom resists disentanglement. To slice the world apart into arbitrary selves and arbitrary structures is to curtail what is possible. Rulership is always a relation of constraint. Domination over another person is often assumed to expand the capabilities of the ruler at the expense of the ruled, yet in practice power usually constrains both. In some occasions, the ruler does expand their personal freedom, quote-unquote, at the cost of overall freedom, but the anemic and arbitrary sense of self required for such a trade-off is its own prison. To divorce yourself from the spark of freedom in another person is to identify with something other than freedom. To reject the active spark that gives you life as an actor in this world, to consign it to death in the name of some happenstance idol. Ultimately, you can either value freedom or some random static dead thing, some specific state of affairs, rather than motion and agency. To identify with freedom, to truly live, is to embrace possibility, is to reject and overcome all walls, including those between one another. Your freedom is my freedom, because freedom tolerates no divisions, accepts no adjectives, belongs to no one. There is simply freedom or constraint, liberation or rulership. This common empathy in liberty is the foundation that makes anarchy a coherent idea, that makes a world without rulership conceivable. Anarchism is more sweeping and more ambitious than any of the political platforms it is often compared with.
As you can see, we can never make a simple list of demands because our aspirations are ultimately infinite. By declaring ourselves for the abolition of rulership itself, we have created a space for striving. The furthest particulars will always be unsettled. Anarchism does not represent a final state of affairs, but a direction, a vector pointing beyond all possible compromises. As the old saying goes, we don't want bread, or even the bakery, we want the stars too. And anarchism has gone in many directions, exploring many concerns and dynamics. However, there are some unavoidable conclusions to our embrace of freedom. Most famously, we oppose the state. Government is defined by its monopoly on coercion. It cannot act but through aggression. Every law or edict that it passes is imposed by centralized apparatuses of violence. The state is, in short, a forcible simplification of human relations, a system caught up in feedback loops that strengthen its tyranny. Rather than building a tolerable and fluidly responsible agreement from the ground up, the state imposes one rigid vision from the top down. Its monopoly on overwhelming violence provides a shortcut to accomplishing things that bypass full negotiations. Not only does this approach suppress freedom in the name of expediency, it encourages everyone to do the same. Once the state exists, it presents a tool that cannot be ignored. If you want to get a given task done, the state makes it enticing to do so through competing for, seizing, and directing the state's coercion. Nearly everyone becomes invested in expanding the power of the state so that it can ensure or enact their desires. The state, that is so often defended as a means of solving collective action problems, is itself a catastrophic collective action problem, with mass murderous consequences. The state suppresses us all. It chains us in service to a limited number of tasks, inherently simplistic directives that can never fully reflect our complex array of desires. The state rules us, but it always seems easier to fight for control of the state, to struggle to win the lottery for its ham-fisted power, than to dissolve its chains. States formed historically through brutal domination and have persisted so virally because they are mistakes hard to unmake. Nevertheless, at certain points, enlightened people throughout history have successfully dissolved states, to varying degrees and with varying permanence, but nevertheless they have. In our era, it lies before us to dissolve not just one state, but the entire global ecosystem of cancerous power systems, both formal nation-states and the smaller state-like entities that they encourage, from corporations to gangs to even cliques, and to establish a more decentralized and responsive society, with not only a few token checks and balances against power, but countless social structures acting as antibodies and an entire populace committed to fighting the emergence of power. There are many possible norms, instincts, and patterns of organizations that impede or check relations of domination, but those that have worked in the past have atrophied in our society, and those approaches that show new promise are, like any radical change, challenging to establish and to popularize. This is obviously no trivial task. Statism is reinforced not merely through the violent threat of the police, but through a culture that embraces domination, and an infrastructure that encourages centralized social relations. The state nurtures organizational and technological forms in its image, simplistic and centralized, so as to more easily engage with them, and its heavy hand distorts economic relations in similar directions, encouraging hierarchy and monopoly. We are not allowed to create or interact except in ways that are easily visible to and controllable by the state. You are either forced to work under the state itself, or under a business that is reflective of it and compliant to it. Everyone else is shuffled into a pool of desperate unemployed or given welfare under intense constraints. We are in countless ways barred from providing for ourselves rather than begging before a boss or a bureaucrat. Under the guise of public quality, individuals are violently suppressed for selling tamales or cigarettes, and the most collective endeavors that treat all participants as equals are banned unless they can grease enough hands and jump through enough red tape. We have been systematically dispossessed of almost all means of living out from under the thumb of one tyrant or another by centuries of genocide and slavery and imperialism. Repeated theft in countless arenas has centralized control into the hands of a few and curtailed our opportunities. This ecosystem of power also nurtures a psychology of brutal competition, not only among those who seek its power, but also among those it represses, twisting them into seeing the world as it does, in terms of power rather than freedom. It violently simplifies our relationships with one another into centralized structures and encourages us to struggle and to dominate one another. Statism isolates. Its centralization is just another way to say that power severs and impedes our connectivity. Instead of distributed, resilient social networks, statism stokes hierarchy and segregation, giving each fewer options in our relations with others and holding back what is possible on the whole. This point about connectivity is an important point that strikes deeper than the specific problems of centralization. It's not enough to not be imprisoned or held down by clear chains. You have to have channels by which to act in the world. A wall has the same effect as a chain. It's not enough to be able to say no to a handful of options. We must have more options to choose from, deeper and richer in their scope and impact upon the world around us. And just as it severs our capacity to connect in direct ways, power cuts us off from truth. It encourages manipulation and constrains the flow of information, which necessarily oppresses us all because a lack of accuracy means a lack of agency. The less grounded our models of the world are, the less actual choice we have to act within it. The more futilely our actions grasp at empty air rather than connecting and moving the world. A lie is often a complex knot that binds, and ignorance can often seem to provide complex options. But simple truths open real possibilities. This focus on deeper realities, rather than abstract or practical rules of thumb, is, incidentally, why we are called radicals. Radical stems from radix, the Latin word for root, and signifies not necessarily an extreme position, but rather a view that gets to the most fundamentals of things. To be a radical is to seek to identify and address the most basic, the most deeply rooted dynamics, to start from the foundations. The radical is only an extremist from the perspective of a world that has abandoned earnest inquiry and lost sight of the most basic truths. Ours is sadly a world of good enough, of the practical, of the immediate at the expense of all else. We have all seen what such a world creates. Misery and encircling mutual enslavement. Too often we worship and cling at the barest of impressions, the most superficial of identities and common banners. We look for quick fixes again and again, hoping to solve myriad social problems and conflicts with the blunt instrument of the state, ignoring the collateral damage and the deepening crises that such means create. We recoil from the longer, harder, and more painstaking path of building a new world in the shell of the old, of spreading and nourishing new relations, projects, norms, and technologies that increasingly make unsustainable our world's instruments of domination. A path that requires complex resistance, continual struggle, with no easy resolution, and no comforting collusion. Our world is gripped in short-sightedness, not just in means but in its ends. We are caught up in a myopia that obscures the freedom to be found in others. It tells us to identify with the limits set for us, to see freedom as just another form of domination, and tyranny as liberation from the complexities of true engagement. It tells us that we are the clothes that we happen to wear, and not the conscious act of choosing between them. It pleads with us to believe that freedom is a thing impossible, incoherent, irreconcilably fractured. Anarchism is not, and has never been, a proclamation that if we overthrow a given state, wherever the extent of that state is to be drawn, utopia will immediately result. Anarchism is not a claim about human nature, or a simplistic reflex of negation. Anarchism is daring to see beyond the suffocating language of power. Anarchism is the lifting of our eyes beyond our immediate preoccupations and connecting with one another, seeing the same spark, the same churning hurricane, the same explosion of consciousness within them that resides within us. Anarchism is the recognition that liberty is not kingdoms at war, but a network interwoven and ultimately unbroken, a single expanse of possibility growing every day. Anarchism is the realization that freedom has no owners, it has only fountainheads.